Good morning, everyone, and I'm back today to talk about the second portion of Ascension Sunday that I talked about last week I would be presenting. It's a little later than I had intended to, but here I am with it. So I just wanted to put up the slide again. We're talking about Acts 1:3. We're talking about Luke. What is Luke pointing to? He makes sure that we know that Jesus was hanging around for 40 days. And the question for me is, why? Why not 50? Why not 30? What is it about 40 days that he wants us to know is significant? Now, what's significant, as we pointed out last week, that there are a lot of 40s in the Old Testament. But there's not a meaningful or significant, holiday built around 40. In Exodus, we find out, Exodus 23, you can read it above me, that there are 3 major feasts that were required mandatory attendance. Passover, Pentecost, which is also known as Shavuot, which happens on the 50th day after Passover. And of course, the last one is the Feast of the Harvest, which is also known as Sukkot. But as of yet, I have not found a 40-day holiday, even though many things happen in the 40-day period. So let's go back over what the Old Testament has to offer about the significance of 40 days. So here we have in the Old Testament 40 days of the storm, the flood storm. And so here we have a picture of Noah's Ark during the storm of 40 days. Some of these we won't cover with pictures. Then we have Jacob's embalming. Then we have Moses ascending Mount Sinai. Then we have the 40 days that the spies sought out the land of Canaan, and the 40 years of wilderness traveling or wandering because of the lack of faith of these spies about the giants in the land. Now that's the one difference, is this is dealing with 40 years versus 40 days. But nonetheless, it's significant, so I put it in here. And then we have Goliath, who taunted Israel for 40 days. And then there's Elijah. Elijah went for 40 days on the strength of the food that God provided for him in the wilderness. And next we have Ezekiel, who bore the sins of Israel by lying on his side for 40 days. And then the same with Judah. He laid on the other side, directed by God, for 40 days. And finally, we have Jonah, who preached destruction to Nineveh would occur in 40 days unless they repented. And so as we look at all these 40 days incident, we must ask ourselves, which of these comes closest to the life of Christ, or incidents or events that happened in the life of Christ? So as we look for that information in the New Testament, we discover that 40 days is used in all 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of Jesus in the wilderness, and of Jesus' post-resurrection here in Acts 1:3. And so here we can easily see and understand the imagery that the New Testament writers were using as Jesus fasted and prayed in the wilderness, resisting temptation, where Israel failed in the Old Testament to trust God when they were hungry and thirsty. Jesus succeeded. He overcame the temptation to take matters into his own hands. Now, I think Luke's intent here in Acts 1:3 is to remind his readers of the 40 days that Moses sat under God's tutelage on Sinai and his reception of the covenant. And he's comparing that with the disciples sitting under Jesus' tutelage, the resurrected Jesus, for 40 days after his resurrection. And they received a new or a refreshed covenant, okay? If we look at the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we have different views of the covenant that was given. Deuteronomy is the covenant that was made with Israel as they entered the promised land. And you can see some of the changes under each new king. A covenant between him and the people would be changed. So we can see that Jesus gave a refreshed, a new covenant, a better covenant, as the writer of Hebrew would say in 8:6, that he obtained a more excellent ministry, and he's the mediator of a better covenant, established on better promises. Okay, and we could also look at Peter in 2 Peter 1:19, where he says we've been given a more sure word of prophecy. So this is telling us that what we've got in Christ Jesus is a better covenant than what Moses gave to Israel. Now, in your lifetime, if you haven't already come across scholars who would try to convince us that it took 30 years for the Jesus followers to make Jesus divine, or go from being a prophet to divine, this one little verse in Acts 1:3, I think, disputes that notion completely. Because it's here that Luke is reporting that the disciples sat under Christ's tutelage and embraced him as Lord. They embraced him as divine here in this verse, even as Moses gave Israel the Torah. He interpreted it from what God taught him, so the disciples, the apostles, do for the new covenant. This is evidence for us that Christ's divinity was well established in the very early movement of the Jesus movement, the very early days of the Jesus movement. And that even though, yes, Luke is reporting this around 63 to 64, that shows us how well established it is, that he can write so succinctly about the divinity of Christ. He didn't need to go through all this explanation that now we go through. He was simply preserving the early oral teachings of the apostles by using pen and paper. Of course, in those days, it was papyrus or vellum. As society progressed from oral to written text, it was a preservation. And so we see in 63, 64, Luke was preserving what had been taught over a 30-year period. I hope you have learned something today. If you have any questions, please, you can contact me. I will put up the last slide here, but also remember, contact me at EVM4, oops, that's not correct, EVM2COR 4.7 @gmail.com. Thanks, and God bless you all.